Good morning on this Sunday, June 28th, and welcome to the Georgia Gang. Georgia's new hate crimes bill now awaits the governor's signature. Coronavirus cases are on the rise in Georgia as some school districts announced their plans for students to return in August. And lawmakers debate and approve massive cuts to the state budget. Theron, Phil, Janelle, and Kathy are all joining us from their homes. The debate and discussion begin right now.
From the Fox 5 studios, the Georgia Gang starts now.
Georgia legislators made it a priority, and now a brand new hate crimes bill in Georgia is one step closer to becoming law. It was an emotional moment for many. State Representative Calvin Smyre could not hold back the tears after final passage of the Georgia hate crimes bill. It was the deaths of Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta and Ahmaud Arbery that put the bipartisan bill back into the spotlight and onto the desks of lawmakers.
It was a difficult task in front of us, and I can, as I said on the floor, I will never forget the value of bipartisan, efforts to tackle such a big issue here.
Now, the bill mandates enhanced sentencing for defendants convicted of targeting a victim based on their race, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, or physical disability, just to name a few. That could mean more prison time for those convicted of crimes. And Kathy, I'll start with you this week. Were you surprised at how quickly this compromise came about?
Yeah, I was a little bit, because the lieutenant governor had put forth a bill that was pretty complicated the policy aspect of the bill, and then kind of dropped back and added police in, which was really an inappropriate place for that language to be. And so it went through a lot of changes real fast. Honestly, I've been working on a hate crimes bill in Georgia for 30 years. 47 other states have it. We went through an awful lot of drama to pass something that's important but relatively simple.
Phil, you were skeptical that lawmakers really could get this done in such a shortened session, but no doubt I think it was the leadership of House Speaker David Ralston that played a key role here. And then when Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan announced he would make it a priority, there was really no stopping the issue from moving forward.
No, there wasn't.
Yeah,
and
I'm
obviously a truly.
That's Phil. Phil.
It was a truly bipartisan effort, as you point out. I think that I'm opposed to mandating sentences, as Janelle kind of pointed out last week. But having said that, the Senate bill, and Lieutenant Governor Duncan deserves a lot of credit along with the Speaker. The Senate version was far better from a legal standpoint. I talked to lawyers of all stripes. And for example, it tightened up some language that was very vague in the House version. And I prefer a jury trial if someone is convicted of a hate crime. The House version just had a judge to do that. So I actually think the Republicans in the Senate made it better from a legal standpoint. And this bill targets, doesn't matter what color you are, you could be black, white, or whatever, but if you're guilty of a hate crime, it cuts all ways.
Theron, I wanted you all to hear from State Representative Calvin Smyre, but he got really emotional when talking about the significance of the moment. There were a lot of more Republicans in the House who voted for it the second time around. But what did you think of some of the no votes that we saw? Theron? Okay, we seem to have lost Theron for a moment. But Janelle, what about some of those lawmakers? Many of them were from Metro Atlanta who voted no.
Yeah, well, like I stated before, I am also not necessarily a fan of hate crime bills. I feel like it's very difficult to legislate heart issues and just to be able to determine what is in the person's heart at the time of committing a crime. However, when I did look at this whole process, I did like the fact that they did go back to the table, and I'm hoping that this shows that there is progress being made, which would, kind of bring down some of the racial tension that we are dealing with right now. So I'm hoping if anything positive comes out of it, that is certainly that. But I'm certainly going to watch these cases and see what the results are of them.
Phil, you mentioned that. Do you think that there could be a possibility that this winds up again at the Georgia Supreme Court? They shot down the one back in 2000. Do you think that could be a repeat of what's happening, or what could happen?
Well, Lori, I think that this could pass constitutional muster. As I mentioned, I think the House version could have been problematic. But I don't see that. Again, the lawyers I've talked to don't see that as a problem. And, you know, just as a political footnote, I would say that the suburban Republicans that voted for this especially may have immunized themselves from attacks from the Democrats, that they're insensitive or whatever.
All right, I'm told we have Theron back. So Theron, I want you to weigh in on all of this, please.
Lori, can you hear me okay?
We can. Sorry about all of these technical issues.
Lori?
Yes. Can you hear
Okay,
me?
great. No, it's totally fine. Real quick, I just want to really go back to something that Kathy said. You know, Kathy Willard just told us that she's been working on this for 30 years. And I went back and I looked at where the hate crime conversation really started in the state. I pulled up, and this is just a few. I know there were a lot of people involved, but just to kind of give our viewers a kind of snapshot of this. You know, back in 1991, State Representative then Nan Orrock introduced a hate crimes bill. Former State Senator Vincent Ford introduced a hate crimes bill in 1998. It was deemed unconstitutionally vague later on that year. Calvin Smyre, as you mentioned, Laura, has been not only the dean of our legislature, but has been working on this for many years. State Senator Lester Jackson, State Representative Karen Bennett, and actually a former State Representative Megan Hansen, who was once a guest panelist on this show, all have been working towards building this momentum that we saw this year in 2020 for hate crimes legislation. So I definitely want to commend Representative Estration, again, Dean Smyre, and also definitely Speaker Ralston, who really, to your point, Laura, earlier, really allowed the conversation to be had in the House, where the bill sat in the Senate for a very long time, for almost 500 days. And then definitely want to compliment the Senate leadership, Lieutenant Governor Duncan, but also State Senator Bill Cowser from Athens. He's a person that really stepped up here and showed some leadership and worked with Democrats to get something done.
And Theron, while we have you and we're good to go, I want to switch gears because Congressman Doug Collins, who's running for U.S. Senate, is calling on Fulton County District Attorney Paul Howard to step aside in the police shooting death of Rashard Brooks, considering all of the politics involved in this case, and Howard is involved in a very competitive runoff. Do you think he should step aside?
I do not think he should step aside, because I'm just going to support what our Attorney General Carr said, Lori. He basically said in order to have a district attorney step aside in a case, that district attorney has to willingly remove or recuse themselves. And so if we're going to say that Paul Howard made these charges, not me saying this, I'm just telling what people are saying, they're saying that this was totally politically driven, then the same amount of criticism needs to be put on Congressman Doug Collins, who's running to be considered to be the next U.S. Senator. And so I think that, you know, at the end of the day, we cannot compare what we saw down in Brunswick with the inability of that DA and other DAs to be transparent and to prosecute the people who were being alleged of this murder. But I do think that there's politics all over here on the Republican side and Democratic side. But I think if you're going to criticize Paul Howard, you definitely got to criticize Doug Collins.
Janelle, last word on this one. Do you think Paul Howard should step aside in this case?
You know what? I actually have to agree with Theron on this one. While I do think that Paul Howard has poisoned the well a bit with a lot of the misinformation that he's provided in a lot of cases when it comes to this case, I do know that there is proper protocol, and I stand beside our Attorney General Chris Carr as well, and what he said, that there's protocol to all of this. And I actually agree with Theron. You know, I just feel like Congressman Collins is kind of calling the pot, you know, the black kettle pot. I'm sorry, I got it wrong, but either way, I think he is definitely, choosing to attack an issue that he's doing himself. So I find that to be quite interesting myself. So I'm with Theron on this one.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone. Well, coming up, Georgia sees a surge in COVID-19 cases across the state. We'll break down the numbers coming up next.
Have a question or comment for the Georgia Gang? Email them at georgiagang@foxtv.com.
The number of coronavirus cases is on the rise here in Georgia. This week, we saw some of the highest one-day spikes ever. We know death rates can lag behind those spikes, but looking at the numbers of deaths, they are on the decline. We're seeing a slight uptick in the numbers of hospitalizations. And Kathy, I guess these numbers should not be a surprise considering the state has opened up again and the number of mass protests where we saw people kind of shoulder to shoulder and kind of yelling out in the streets. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's a little less about the protests because most of the protesters were wearing masks, but I think it has a lot to do with people congregating in restaurants and bars. I'm seeing it certainly in Atlanta, all over the place, lots of places I'm just not comfortable being in because people aren't being careful and safe enough. And it'd be great to start hearing from the governor and our public health staff again. You know, we're talking, the president has said we're doing more tests and that's why we're getting more numbers. But when you start looking at the increase in hospitalizations and deaths, then you know those numbers are going up in a different kind of way. And my sources say what we're going to see in the next couple of weeks are hospitals starting to get overloaded again. And we just can't have that happen. It's going to set the economy back as well as create a far more dangerous situation, particularly for people who live in rural areas and don't have access to hospitals.
Theron, let's follow up on this because the governor is encouraging folks to wear a mask and keep their distance. But how do you get that message to the younger people where we're seeing the surges?
Yeah, I think I agree with Kathy. I think this is another opportunity here, and I know Phil has mentioned this as well, for the governor, who I said last week, who does wear his mask, unlike the President of the United States of America. And so, Lori, I think this is the time where I know you and I agree on this, is that we need to have some young people maybe speak out on behalf of the governor. I mean, maybe have non-elected officials that can reach these young people that are actually organizing these protests. And I agree with Kathy. I think we can't blame this on the peaceful protests that are going on, because a lot of those folks were doing their best to social distance, not at all times, but also they were wearing masks. And so I think the governor should, this week, do what he did best weeks prior, and that is get out in front of this, talk to the people of Georgia, make sure that everyone's wearing masks, and just be truthful, which he has been, about the numbers, but make sure they're consistent and we're getting them on time so we can prepare for what Kathy just told us about, which is going to be this next wave that we're going to have to endure.
Phil, I want you to comment about, what Theron and Kathy have said, but also, school systems have some difficult decisions. And this week we saw Cobb, Marietta, and Gwinnett announce that they are giving parents a choice on whether they want their kids to attend physically or virtually. I mean, I think this is much better than any type of hybrid model where kids could go 2 or 3 days, because I think that really puts a bind on working parents. But what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think Cobb County does have a pretty good school model for the fall semester, and that is that parents can opt for the traditional learning in the classroom, following procedures, or continue to do online learning through the rest of that semester. I hear mixed reviews on how the online learning is going, and we all know stories where parents are struggling and it's not working out well in some schools while it's working well in other schools. I will say this about the overall, I'm glad the deaths obviously are down in Georgia. I do think, and I watch television just like everybody else, I do think a lot of those demonstrators did not wear masks. They did not socially distance. And I was out at the Lake Country recently, Lake Oconee, and a lot of people were not socially distancing. And I think that, again, you need to be very careful and cautious, especially in classrooms. Again, going back to Cobb County, I see where masks are available, but they're optional. And of course, fortunately, younger people, are not going to die from this, with very few exceptions. And so, but I do think, I will agree on one last note, I do think the governor and the health officials do need to give a statewide report on where we are and where we're going.
And Janelle, let's talk about that. I mean, how do you convince younger people to wear masks? I mean, kids are going to be going back to school. I think it's almost impossible to require young kids to wear masks. But, what do we do when we know that masks indeed prevent the spread of the coronavirus? You can't really force people to wear masks, but we know some stores require them, and some bars or maybe some movie theaters. But what do you think about this issue?
So here's the thing about the mask, right? So I remember at one point we had an issue where we talked about how the coronavirus can live, and particularly COVID-19 can live on surfaces for a certain amount of time. And so there was an issue about touching your mask and touching your face. Well, I'm seeing people, wearing multiple masks in and out. They're touching their faces. They're pulling it off, pulling it back on. I'm not necessarily convinced that the mask is what's going to fix all of this. What I'm also noticing is that after I spoke with the governor's office and just kind of got some information about this, and we do know that a high percentage of these cases are young adults, and that's due to Memorial Day that just passed not too long ago. That's also due to the protesting and the demonstrations and people not social distancing. I do think that people should be responsible for their own health, and if they feel safe doing something, then that's what they should do. When it comes to the death, we are not seeing a high percentage of deaths or hospitalizations, and those are the key indicators that we really should be looking at. I found out that some of the deaths that have came in are still 50% of these deaths are coming from nursing homes and long-term care facilities. But a lot of these individuals have been sick, some of them for over a month, and are now passing away, unfortunately. So I think what we need to do is just keep watching the key indicators. We anticipate numbers rising. Like I said, we're doing more testing, and then a lot of people are interacting more. So that was an anticipated issue that the state was prepared for.
Theron, as we see some of these numbers rise, especially the surge in cases, we're getting word that Morehouse College has canceled all of its fall sports. Do you think that this could be a trend that we may see?
Yeah, I read that, Lori, and I would tell you, Morehouse College was very specific. They were not canceling their sports programs, particularly football, but they were canceling the 2020 season, and that's really disheartening to me. I played football at Clark Atlanta University. My best friend son, Cameron Irie, is going to play football at Clark Atlanta University, and so all these young people who have been playing football and other sports for so long have been preparing for this moment to be able to go and be a student and get your education and hopefully graduate, but also the opportunity to be a student athlete. And so, not criticizing Morehouse for what they've done, but I do think because it's Morehouse and because it's HBCU, you're probably going to see other colleges and universities in the state of Georgia start really considering how and if they will be able to operate their sports programs with COVID-19 still on the rise.
Still some tough decisions, and we feel for all those student athletes and all the coaches and all of the schools who are having to make these difficult decisions. Thanks, everyone. Well, coming up, no state agency was immune to the massive budget cuts caused by the coronavirus, but the pain not nearly as bad as expected. We'll discuss after the break.
Join the discussion on the Georgia Gang Facebook page and watch past episodes on the Georgia Gang YouTube channel.
This week, Governor Brian Kemp revised his revenue estimate, asking for 10% in budget cuts that once looked like 14%, and that's about $1 billion. Well, with that news comes the news less state employee furloughs than expected, but a $950 million cut from education will be felt. Phil, let's start with you. Almost $1 billion from education, which makes up more than half of the state budget. Governor Kemp dipped into the reserves for $250 million, but did lawmakers do the best that they could under the circumstances? Phil?
That's a tough question. That's a very tough question. Thank goodness that as you point out, the governor's revenue estimates went down to 10%. That saved a lot of all state employees from being furloughed. That was a big problem, and there weren't the cuts that we expected, say with law enforcement and in other areas. But yes, education is a huge problem. That was a vexing concern. I know lawmakers from both parties went back and forth. I'm told, and we all saw where Chairman Terry England, the Appropriations House Chair, said that he didn't think local districts would be affected. I hope he's right, especially some of the districts that are low income and don't have a tax base. So that's going to have to be something that's going to be addressed in January for the next General Assembly.
Kathy, I'll pose that same question to you. Do you think lawmakers did everything that they could under the circumstances?
No, absolutely not. It doesn't appear that they're going to raise the tobacco tax. If they had raised that to the national average, they would have generated probably another $400 to $500 million, and they could have cut that in half. They have lots of tax credits they could have eliminated. One, my favorite that I wish they'd eliminate, are about $150 million in tax credits for contributions to private schools. That would have been got you 3/4 of the way to that. And I think education is so important right now, especially as schools and administrators and teachers and parents and kids are all struggling to find their new way through this, and it's got to cost more money. I can't fathom that school systems are not spending more to try to adjust to this reality.
Janelle, let's talk about that tobacco tax, because at the time of this taping, the lawmakers were considering a tax on vaping products, but not tobacco. Why the discrepancy here?
I'm not quite sure why the discrepancy is there, but I do want to kind of push back a little bit on Kathy when she talks about education, because I remember before the pandemic, we were talking about the trying to get raises for our teachers, and it was just kind of like a pushback on the 4% cut in order to help take care of our teachers. And then now we want to push for education and say that now we want to make sure we're doing these things. But I think as of right now, everyone's in a tough position. I mean, not only were we already dealing with, making sure that we create a budget that creates a reserve for later, but now we're having to create an even bigger reserve and make up the difference from the pandemic. So I think everyone is in a tough place. I'm not quite sure about the tax credits and all of that. I mean, I think that right now, I know there are certain tax credits, like for instance, the film tax that is synonymous to Georgia in a way, because we are offering a lot more for people to come and do their movies here. And I think that if we kind of focus on making sure that we're driving revenue to the state, it'll ultimately make up the difference.
Farron, the Speaker of the House held firm on those special tax cuts, that there would not be cuts to any of those special tax breaks that are offered, calling that move a jobs killer. Do you agree with him?
Yeah, that's one that actually got a lot of conversation at the Capitol, and I think the Speaker definitely felt that he had to defend his comments, and he feels very strongly that would kill jobs. But I do agree with some of the people that push back on him by saying that, at a time when we did not hear a lot about really clear solutions for alternative methods of revenue or forms of revenue, I think that the criticism was definitely going to be something that he was going to get. But at the end of the day, I just want to go back to something you said, Laura. I do believe that the legislators did the best that they could to actually try to do what they could around the budget. But the cuts to education, I mean, that's the one thing that I would say that a lot of us was shocked about. And so I would hope that that's got to be a top priority, K through 12 education, when the legislators reconvene next year.
Phil, do you agree with the Speaker? I mean, is it time, though, to look at all these tax breaks for certain industries?
I sympathize with what the Speaker said about jobs, because we are concerned about that. But as you've heard me say in the program before, and Senator Chuck Hufstetler and a lot of others have done a lot of studies, there are some sweetheart tax breaks to companies, for example, that should not be there. Some of these companies are going to be locating in great locations, whether you give them breaks or not, for example. And so I thought that there could be some sort of compromise with a few of these tax breaks. And even with the film tax break, I believe in keeping a generous break, but the audit was stinging last spring on how there were abuses with just that tax credit, and that could have been fixed.
All right, we'll have to wait till next session, everyone. Coming up, winners and losers. Stay tuned. Amy, let me know how much time, because I'm not sure if this clock is right, because it stopped and started. And
I want to see that.
2:40. As that could be 2:40 or 3:10. She gives me a 30-second pad, but I told her I don't need it. Okay, we'll just wing it. Kathy doesn't have a lot, she said, so she'll go last. Phil, we'll start with you.
Time now for the week's winners and losers.
Well, we will start by helping out our friend Janelle. It is the pot calling the kettle black. Okay, so I didn't want to joke about it during our serious topics, but I thought we could kind of sneak that in during winners and losers. Phil, we will start with you.
Well, thank you, Lori. I think first, my winners are going to be the 8 Atlanta City Council members who resisted further demoralizing the Atlanta Police Department by this idiotic suggestion to take away $73 million from the police budget and put it in some sort of so-called holding account. That would have been devastating, especially at a time when we're trying to focus on public safety and restoring law and order. And my loser again has to be this week, Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. There's too much permissiveness. We cannot continue. Yes, we're for police reform. I don't think anybody would object to having a discussion about that in coming weeks and months. But to allow for 2 days armed protesters to just take over the burned out Wendy's area without a police presence was outrageous.
Okay, we will have the discussions coming in the next few weeks. Theron, over to you.
All right, my first winner is going to be Mr. James Allen. I want to send my condolences to his family. He unfortunately passed this week. He had spent 28 years with the Atlanta Housing Authority and also was a key member of the commission board there, so definitely want to send my condolences to him. Big shout out to Pedro Cherry, who just became the CEO of Atlanta Gas and Light. Also, John Hudson is a winner this week. He has been named the president and CEO of Nicor Gas. And lastly, big shout out to Bentina Terry, who's been recently promoted in Georgia Power as the senior vice president of Metro Atlanta and corporate relations. So definitely want to make all of them my winners this week.
All right, Janelle, over to you. We have about a minute.
Okay, great. So my winner is a Congressional District 5 candidate and opponent to Congressman John Lewis, Angela Stanton King. She did an interview and she took on the Breakfast Club, and I feel like her agenda was so much better than the non-agenda that Joe Biden presented to them. I also want to give a highlight to an anonymous superfan of the show. I actually received an enlightening letter in the mail, so that to that viewer that I know is watching, thank you so much. It was a great letter. We need more people like you. And last but not least, a special shout out to my new friend Fred, who I worked on a filming project with him this past week, and he did a great job.
Anonymous superfan, I love it. And Kathy, to you.
Let's see, I'll give a shout out to Jim Durrett, who was named the new CEO at the Buckhead Coalition. He was formerly at the Buckhead CID. I'm sure he'll do a great job there. And I want to just recognize Pedro Cherry, too. He and I and Theron were in the same leadership Atlanta class, so we're still the best class ever. And I guess that's it. Thanks.
All right. Best class ever goes to 2006. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. And I just want to give a shout out to historic
16.
Banning Mills. We spent the week there with my kids, and it's an amazing place and kind of an untold secret. So thanks, everybody. We will see you again next week. Bye-bye.